Hello, everyone. My name is Kerstin Carlson, and I'm very glad to be recording this on June 29th, 2020, as a webinar. My talk today is about refugees, some of the rights that have been impacted by COVID-19, and the illegality of irregular migration responses by the European Union. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about what I see as big legal issues that can be used to have a human rights discussion. So one of the things that I find very shocking about the migration crisis, or what you want to call it, is the ways in which we talk about it. So it seems more and more that the word migrant becomes a kind of category of other. So we start to make distinctions between worthy migrants who might be refugees as opposed to economic migrants who are not qualified as refugees. That's a legal classification. But then even in our popular discourse, we start asking, well, women and children, surely they're vulnerable and require help, but maybe not young men. So one of the things that concerns me when I think about the question and the problem of migration, beyond the sort of terrible conditions that people find themselves living in and the stubbornness of a European response or lack of response to this, is also what I see as a growing, I feel I have a growing concern about the ways in which we talk about migrants and how it is that we categorize this. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what it was, how I found myself here, and say a little bit about who I am. I'm American. I live in Denmark and work also in Paris. I'm in Paris right now. I'm a professor, a law professor, and I teach international law with a focus on international criminal law. So last summer, something happened in international criminal law connected to migration that made me very excited and very hopeful. And that was that two researchers from Paris filed a brief before the International Criminal Court saying that the International Criminal Court, or requesting that the International Criminal Court should investigate EU migrant policy towards migrants, as a crime against humanity. And they made the argument that EU leadership and various other European politicians are criminally responsible, should potentially face jail time for the policies they've put in place that impact migrants. And this, it's a strange thing maybe to say, but this filled me with hope, because for two reasons. One, because I think that we're really stalled on the question of migration. On the one hand, there's a human rights community that looks at the conditions in which migrants live and is appalled and tries to do something to raise awareness. And there are many successful awareness-raising initiatives, and yet at the same time, the numbers grow, the misery grows, and there's no resolution. And then simultaneously, international criminal law, so the field that I study, is beset with a series of problems. That it's an idea that arose out of the Nuremberg tribunals in the Second World War, the idea of using law in the place of other more violent measures, like, say, hanging, putting people on trial, demonstrating that certain behavior was punishable, criminal, but in this sense, regularizing bad action so that one could be jailed, although, of course, after the Second World War, several people were actually put to death. Now, no one in international criminal law is put to death, but instead they're put in jail. And this way, insisting that there are certain kinds of state policies or state actions that are impermissible, that are criminal. So no matter how effective it is to run a campaign which involves crimes against humanity, it's illegal. And if you do this, you run the risk of going to jail. So that's a very powerful idea. And in 2002, the International Criminal Court was created, and it was a huge advance. It went from idea, like a treaty in 1998, to an actual court in just 4 years. It was very fast. But since that time, the International Criminal Court has essentially met with a series of failures. It's having a lot of trouble getting any kind of big leaders. It, at this point in time, has been accused of only prosecuting rebels, and it's really been primarily focused on African states. So we now, after 20 years almost of work at the International Criminal Court, have a lot of pushback, where African states who were early adopters of the court, who were really on board and really excited, are starting to call it a neo-colonial court, or saying that this is a court that's being used by the world's richest countries as one more method of punishing Africa. So an idea that is a very powerful idea is under threat. And of course, the court is deeply flawed, as many institutions are, but it would still be really a terrible shame for the court to fail because it hasn't learned how to work yet. So for me, what Juan Branco and Omar Schatz did last summer in Paris in filing this request of the ICC to investigate crimes against humanity committed in Europe was a doubly strong move. First, it was an attempt at addressing the migrant situation a new way. A series of courts have tried to ask, how can we Europeans do better about migrations, and have failed. And it was also, in a sense, a capacity or an attempt to rehabilitate international criminal law. So I read about this in The Guardian. I didn't know these young men, these researchers, but I just got excited for those two reasons. And so I wrote I wrote a blog post about it. And it was one of those things that happens where you read something and then you're possessed by an idea. And I sat and I think I didn't eat, I didn't sleep. I wrote this blog post. Sorry, that's me trying to be too fancy. This connected me to Elpida because Elpida read this blog piece and contacted me and said to me, it seems like you're working on things, I'm trying to work on things, perhaps we can work together. So this in a way is the best thing that the internet can do. So here is the blog piece, you can go and read it. And I would say the value of that piece is I try and sort of lay out what it is legally that has been a response so far to violations of human rights of migrants, and why the idea of using international criminal law is an idea whose time has come, that this is an effective use of international criminal law. It's the right use for the institution, and it can potentially address both the crimes against humanity that migrants are suffering, as well as saving the ideas behind international criminal law. So feel free to read that. After Elpida contacted me, I had been, again, I work on law and courts, I teach law, and I work in transitional justice. So I would say I'd been following migration very much from the point of view of someone who makes her life in Europe. I feel like I'm living through a terrible violation of human rights, and what am I doing about it, right? So because I live in Denmark, most of the time Denmark has a pretty terrible record about how it manages refugees. So, but aside from teaching my students and going to marches, what was I doing? So I had the sense that I wanted to do more. So Elpida and I began to brainstorm how we might do more. And we decided that we would start a project. So I said, all I can do to help is to try and work through these legal issues because that's what I know. So we put together this project, which we call On the Edge. And that project is together with Elpida and Vana Kostelia, who's a visual artist in Switzerland. And the idea was that we would start with something and I would try and follow what it was that Branco and Schatz had done when they looked, and their brief, it was 250 pages that they sent to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, was an investigation of the Mediterranean policy. So there they said, the European Union and its member states are using the Mediterranean. They're deliberately using the Mediterranean as a barrier. They understand that people will try and cross it. They understand that people will die, that this policy, it's a piece of their deterrence, the refugee deterrence policy, to have people dying in the Mediterranean. And that is a crime against humanity. So there's a series of legal definitions, what constitutes a crime against humanity. And that has to do with something that's systematic, that's worked against a collective, but you don't need to have a war. So crime against humanity is really the kind of crime that's big enough to encompass this and is within the jurisdiction of the ICC. So they've already made that model, they've submitted to the ICC, they haven't heard anything back yet. And so the idea was that we could try and do something similar and we would look at Moria. So I gathered some students, we started working at the end of December and we worked through January, and I applied and got money for a workshop in Athens that we should have had this summer. And then of course there was COVID-19, which shut everyone down, and that really shut down work on my project. That was just something, somehow the organization of the project was something that I couldn't manage during COVID. So all those things sort of stopped. I had students who did research, et cetera, but I didn't manage to get any further. But this still exists as a possibility, right? The idea that we could write this brief. In the meantime, in February, a kind of another example of what Branco and Schatz were trying to do with their request to the ICC that it open an investigation came up in the negative. There, other human rights activists and lawyers had, back in 2017, made a similar request that the ICC investigate Australia. And Australia also has really terrible and rights violating, international law violating policies regarding migrants. And in February of 2020, the ICC said that it would not, in fact, open an investigation. So what happens, the ICC can look at cases within its purview, it has jurisdiction over its members, and if there's a violation of one of the crimes for which it has jurisdiction, like a crime against humanity, then it can open an investigation. And if in the course of its investigation it finds crimes have occurred, then it can in fact indict someone. So the investigation is the first thing that has to happen. And this is what Schatz and Branco have asked for last year regarding the Mediterranean. The 2017 attempt to do this for Australia was shut down in February 2020. But at the same time, this is Australia. So you can see that Australia is really kind of terrible. And they have a very direct communication policy where they say to migrants what they will and won't permit. But in the meantime, we had Corona-19 and sort of news shut down. The camps literally shut. There was quarantine. We couldn't see what was happening. And in all this, of course, and how can I forget, the EU-Turkey deal, wherein the European Union had paid 3 billion euros to Turkey with a promise of another 3 billion in order to keep irregular migrants within Turkey, to not let them cross into Europe. That deal started to fall apart as Turkey, under stress from continued fighting in Syria, concerned that it wasn't seeing the next amounts of money, threatened Europe essentially and said that they were going to start opening the border and even allegedly bust some refugees, some migrants to the border, and allowed people to start crossing again. So in February and March, as the world was starting to follow more and more the corona outbreak, and as the possibility of lockdowns in Europe began to arise, we had also this sort of burgeoning violence in the Aegean Sea, where there were more and more refugees who were once again starting to make the trip. And what we have is a series of terrible videos of the Greek Coast Guard, or Frontex, which is the EU-financed mission that guards in the Aegean, actually pushing refugees back to Turkey. And this is a pretty clear violation of international law. So the way that international law works regarding refugees, everything starts with the 1951 Refugee Convention. And that law is really straightforward in that it says that a person who has a well-founded fear of persecution in the country that they're from has the right to be fed, welcomed, and treated as if they were a citizen of a country that will protect them. So as I was saying, the Refugee Convention has been commonly understood as a pretty solid piece of international criminal law. It was agreed after the Second World War. It's very clear about what protections it offers, and it's very clear about what violations are impermissible. So all of those things are clear. Unfortunately, practice is deeply imperfect, and it's something that has only been getting, I guess I would say, less and less perfect over the past several decades, leading to where we are now. But there seems to be, or I cannot find, I am not aware of any source that would not say that a pushback of a refugee is a violation. The centerpiece of the 1951 convention is called non-refoulement, and it's the notion that you may not push a person back to a place where they are in danger. And again, these are really, in a sense, they're very simple ideas. They're deeply embedded European ideas, because this convention was written by Europeans who had just known the pain of the Second World War and who had just been refugees themselves. So the convention was drafted by a bunch of people who wanted to ensure that simply because you happen to live in a country that has fallen apart, or you happen to live under a regime that's targeting you, that you still will have rights in other countries. That was the attempt that was made. That's what's enshrined in the 1951 convention. So in February of 2020, we start to see a series of videos where the Greek Coast Guard and Frontex actually come and push back boats that are in the water. And there's some pretty violent video. Then there's some sort of lesser violent video where boats are first disabled, and then Greek Coast Guard boats will come in and try and make waves that push the boats back into Turkish waters. And this is all very complicated because the Frontex mission has a series of European nations involved, all of whom, of course, are signatories of the 51 Convention, all of whom are at least certainly would represent themselves as being proponents of human rights, but some of them very strong proponents of human rights. So there was an excellent expose in Der Spiegel, and there was a German television program precisely about this. And of course, Germany is a very strong proponent of human rights and is very aware of the kinds of crimes against humanity that are occurring here, because Germany is particularly committed to not being part of these kind of acts, given its own very particular history. So there has been attention paid to this in news media. And in fact, the commissioner of the EU commented on it herself, Leiden, but there she actually congratulated Greece on its strong protection of European borders and called it Europe's shield. So this, I think, is pretty alarming. So we clearly have a policy that's pushing back, and we also have very little disagreement in international law that pushbacks of this kind are illegal. Refugees are entitled to all these rights. Economic migrants are not. If you are moving from your country because you would prefer to live somewhere else, and you're doing it irregularly, you might not be entitled to any rights whatsoever. But because refugees have so many rights, the first thing every country has to do is process an irregular migrant. Someone shows up on your shores, and you have to deduce, is this person fleeing a well-founded fear of persecution or not? And before you've answered that question, you have to, at the very least, hold them comfortably. You may not push them back. That's simply impermissible. So it's pretty shocking to me. It seems like these are the kinds of violations that absolutely would be recognized under international criminal law as crimes against humanity. I in a sense, unless they were deemed to be not prevalent enough, right? The only thing that could really stand out is if they were seen to not be systemic, right? If you only have one bad act, well, that's not repetition. But since February, we have a number of reports indicating that this is happening. So when Elpida and Van and I sat down and talked about how we might first, what kind of action we might take, and I met with my students in December and January, I was imagining that we could make a claim that the conditions in the camps in Moria and in other camps in Chios, the refugee camps that are seriously overcrowded, places for 3,000 people, now housing 20,000 people, no running water, hopelessness, violence in the camps themselves, that the policy based on the EU-Turkey deal, which is what makes it such that refugees or migrants, irregular migrants, those who arrive in Greece, who manage to get to Greece, are held in these camps and aren't forwarded to better facilities, still highly imperfect facilities, but better facilities, that itself could be understood as a crime against humanity. And I would say, sadly, although in some ways powerfully, the examples we can use for any work we'd want to do have only gotten worse. I think the pushbacks is, in a sense, an even stronger legal argument. This is really problematic. So there are a few NGOs that have been working quite effectively to make people aware that this is happening. And I have a list, I think, on the next page of sort of places that you can go and look. But here, what NGOs are starting to do is they're starting to record stories. And one, of course, this is effective because it raises awareness, and this can make people be alert to the crimes that are being committed in their names and our names. But of course, it's also a piece of evidence that eventually can be used if one wants to try and make the case that there is a systematic abuse here, that this abuse is planned, that it's not a mistake. Right? So these NGOs are doing a service in a number of ways. There's also been a story, and I didn't end up putting it in the slides, but one of the Frontex boats in March was manned by a Danish crew, and they were, they say, instructed to push back a boat of refugees or migrants, irregular migrants. I use the terms interchangeably because we don't know until we process people whether or not they'll qualify as refugee or not. I personally prefer irregular migrant because I think it groups everyone together, and I think making a distinction between people who have political versus economic worries is perhaps not very meaningful. In any event, this Danish manned Frontex boat refused to comply with orders to push back the irregular migrants. And that's now been, that was all part of Danish news in March. It's now part of Anglophone news. It was in Politico in June. And when this came out, the EU Parliament actually wrote to the Commission saying, what's up with this? What is Frontex doing? And in June, the Commission wrote back and said, we can't say anything about the accuracy of this, but we'll look into it. So again, what we see, we start to see these reports and we see patterns, and that's obviously very problematic. At some level, I think there's always a problem thinking about pushbacks when you're looking at the kind of the very destructive system that migrants are living under. There's something almost frustrating about focusing on something as small in that system as a pushback, right? Because the idea that being pushed back into Turkish waters, or people who make it ashore, there's a journalist on the island of Lesbos who's also documented boats that have come offshore and people have disappeared. And it's believed that those people were pushed back as well, but they actually landed, right? And does that make a difference? Normally you make it to Greek water and you're as good as on Greece. That's what the law would hold. But somehow that too seems an even bigger affront, right? You made it into the safe haven and now you're being pulled away. So there's something that seems almost wrong about focusing on this one particular piece of the legality when you're talking about a system that imprisons children, that makes people hopeless. And I'll talk in a second about what I've been hearing from people who are helping with information coming from Greece about what the actual lived experience is of irregular migrants. And also those who are actually found, who pass the refugee test and are labeled as refugees, what happens to those people, right? That there's a series of human rights violations that is occurring. And so to pick this one particular one of the pushbacks, it perhaps seems silly. But again, for me, the way I perceive it is you need a lever. Somehow you need something that says, this is too much, this is unacceptable, where do we stop? And this pushback arguably is that lever, because there's no justification for it under international criminal law. It is simply a bridge too far, which is one of the things that makes it powerful. So if we can continue to record the pushbacks, we can continue to see how many there are, we can collect that information, then that makes it possible to make an argument, I think a fairly strong argument, to the International Criminal Court that here's a place that crime is occurring. Now, whether that means that the International Criminal Court will take action, of course, is a deeply political question. And so far, I think anyone's bet would be no, but one never knows. Like, I think one of the things that's really essential to us when we think about this as human rights activists is, what does it take to change people's position? So I think when we think about movements and we think about how we talk about things, we can look back over the 20th century and we can think about how many terrible things used to happen, which we now think of as problematic. It doesn't mean they don't happen anymore, but we no longer accept them as simply a tragedy. We now think of them as criminal. And the power of moving something from an unfortunate event, oh, there was a war, it happened where you live, that's very unfortunate for you, you lost your family, to a crime. There was a war, someone was responsible, we're going to hold people who do bad things responsible for them, and perhaps that will deter and change action in the future. So in my view, this is really the power of human rights. It's a narrative power. It's about changing things from simple either accidents or some sort of force of nature into something which has a man-made cause and therefore can be addressed through man-made solutions. this is the power of law, in my view. So again, the tragedy of the pushback and the horror of the people to whom that's happening, having their engines disabled, being so close to what they hope is their next step in a better life. In some cases, as these reports tell us, being transferred actually onto another raft, which is then set adrift, moving back towards Turkey. To the degree there's a silver lining to that very dark cloud, it's that this obvious violation of the law makes it easier to talk about migration, not simply as a tragedy that befalls some other people and we're lucky we're not them, but more something that we are responsible for. Our governments are doing this thing, this very active thing. They are shoving these people back, and it's not an accident, and it is a crime. This becomes one of the ways that we can think about this. And here I wanted to look a little bit about, or speak a little bit to how I think that COVID-19 is impacting this situation. It's a situation that's been long in the making, and I haven't spoken about the EU-Turkey deal. That's pretty interesting. It's legally interesting and problematic. It's been challenged actually by 3 irregular migrants who did not want to be displaced back to Turkey, and the first challenges before the EU General Court failed, but those are now on appeal. So there may be some legal movement there about the legality of that agreement in and of itself, right? This is really that 2016 deal made by European countries with Turkey to pay Turkey to keep people out of Europe may itself violate non-refoulement, right? The question of how safe a country Turkey is really up for debate. And of course, the conditions of people living there, not to mention whether or not there are other rights that are violated by European countries saying that there's that sort of very basic freedom of movement doesn't exist, that people who are attempting to get to Europe should be stopped before they get here. Although obviously that is not just happening in Turkey, and that's a big part of the Omar Schatz brief. It was looking at Mediterranean, but that of course has to do with European, Italian, and EU deals made with Libya, which is its own terrible sort of different kettle of worms, as we say. There is also a growing movement. People look at the way that the European Union continues to move its borders, where the European Union borders are no longer in the Mediterranean around the countries as we know them, but they now move further and further east into Asia and south into Africa, where there are EU-financed troops that are stopping migrants along routes, even south of the equator, right? An attempt to sort of stop people where they are. And I think the legality of that is something that we could also discuss and is in question. But all of those things for another time or for other discussions, I suppose. But just to finish here, to think a little bit about COVID, because this is, I guess, the theme, right? We're speaking about the corona flowers, what it is that's happening. And one of the things that concerns me about COVID-19, aside from the obvious problems of being a refugee somewhere where there's no running water, where you're trapped in a camp, where you're supposed to socially distance, and it's just not physically possible. So you can't wash, you can't be distant, all of the danger that you aren't eating regularly, that you're under a great deal of stress, all of the things that put your health generally in danger, which are of course only exacerbated by a global pandemic. But in addition to those public health concerns about COVID, I, from my situation as a kind of critical lawyer, would say that there's a silence and a kind of a blanket that Corona has thrown over our surveillance, right? Our human rights awareness. So I've been really fortunate now to meet through ELPIDA people who are following the Greek press for me and who have contact with people who are migrants who are in camps. So I feel I'm getting much more information than I had been. But just scouring my mainstream Anglophone press, where are the stories? How can one find out what's happening? I felt like it's been very, very difficult. Now, I think in general, the story, there's kind of a subtext to the story of COVID-19, which is that it's very difficult to see and understand any policies in Europe at this time. And I say this about lockdowns, right? So having experienced lockdown in both Denmark and France, there's a great deal of variety in the official regulations, how they change, and how they're enforced. And I think that we all are missing a centralized discussion of how does this work and who is bearing the brunt for this pandemic, right? So people like me who can work from home, that's obviously, I'm in a very privileged position, but many, many people are not. And who and how is that impacting? I see some discussions, but I really don't see the numbers. So in general, I'm really struck by the way that Corona in general has been a blanket. We cover a lot of things. And with migration, this is first and foremost. So because of Elpida, I now have had connections to this screen that I put up here. Obviously this is made by Europe Must Act. There's a series of NGOs that have been following, but this is a critique of the politics, the policies, Greek policies regarding how it is that refugees are kept in quarantine and how other people are kept in quarantine. So as I said, I think we're all kept a bit in the dark about quarantine, but we're also all now, at least I, in Paris and where you find yourselves in the world, but we're out of most forms of quarantine. We socially distance, but we can now go outside. We no longer need to write ourselves a note to go outside. It's now possible to take a metro, right? So we have our movement back with a series of precautions. But in detention centers and camps, there's kind of a lockdown that's still very much in effect. And from what I see, there aren't a lot of cases of COVID. In fact, really, the cases that have been located have been stopped, but there's no way to continue this protection, and there's certainly no fairness to an ongoing quarantine in really desperate conditions with none of the amenities that the rest of us have to sort of survive our quarantine. And then this slide from Mare Liberum, or I'll give you the information for how to follow them. But this I thought also was really powerful. And in a way, this leads me to what it is that we hoped to do with On the Edge. So in one of my previous slides, I said, well, so when Elpida contacted me and then we got together with Vana, there was this question of, well, what can we do? What would be useful? We've been talking about trying to do some kind of media seminar, and the plan was to do it in Athens, maybe even as early as this summer, because I teach in the summer. So I'd hoped that I could bring my students to Athens and we could have a media workshop and they could learn and we could learn and all things would be great. That obviously didn't happen, but we're still considering that we might do this. But I think for me, at least, the central question in the migration crisis, the migration topic is, how do we talk about it? How do we make sure? So Omar Schatz, one of the authors of the ICC brief, at a migration talk in Paris in January before everything shut down, it was a big conference, and he had a series of people speak, and he's done this before. He's gathered people, so people who are people who come from the law side, people who come from the human rights side. I talked about the international criminal law elements, which is to say the ways, what it is that we haven't touched yet. So I was sort of focusing on the question of sovereignty, that sovereignty and citizenship is still something that's totally national. So whereas we've internationalized human rights law and we no longer let states do whatever they want to people, that's no longer legal. We still give states great sort of carte blanche to decide who's a citizen. And those citizenship laws, of course, are tremendously important because this, as Mare Liberum says, is all a question of what passport do you have, right? So one passport affords you all the rights and the absence of that passport affords you none of the rights, right? And this is shocking. But one of the things that Omar Schatz said in this January 2020 seminar at EHSS here in Paris was he sort of ended the day by discussing the problem of the narrative around migration. And he discussed it, I think the phrase he used, I don't want to misquote him, but he said, here we're starting to see a language of extermination, right? Like, how do we start to talk about people in a way that makes the bad things that end up happening to them possible? And I know that sounds very terrifying and perhaps harsh, but I think that the facts bear this out, that we tolerate migrant death and we tolerate terrible, inhumane conditions for migrants. And I wonder how is it that we do this? And that's how I, in a sense, began my talk. I feel like when we talk about migrants and what we expect for them, the language that surrounds it is becoming more and more problematic. And the language itself is what opens up the possibility of, well, we'd rather have our fortress Europe, our way of life. We don't want to share this. Why should we have to? And those are all sort of we've seen historically precursors to a series of worse and worse violations, which can end in extermination. And it's happened before. We want it not to happen again. So what can we do to fight against those narratives, those formulations, those ways of thinking about people? And here, I think that the law is a huge tool because, again, to take something which was presented as a tragedy or even presented as a wrong, how dare this poor person come knocking on my door? Why don't they just make things better in the place that they're from? To take that narrative and to turn it around and to insist on this as a crime. How can it be in a continent so rich and so full of capacity that we don't recognize this need, which, by the way, our law recognizes, that we refuse to apply the law that we ourselves have created, right? So to change the narrative in that way, I think, is a tool that we have. So obviously the other big tool that human rights and human rights movements have always made use of are tools of empathy, right? How is it that we can rehumanize people who have been dehumanized? And I think that a number of the NGOs that I'm seeing are engaging in projects like that. So the last thing that we had hoped to do with our Athens talk was to, in a sense, be part of this civic media project. And the sorry, I'll get back to this in just a second, but this is my, my slide of NGOs. And here we have, there's the Refocus Media Labs. They've been working a great deal in the camps themselves. And they have been, their hashtag Leave No One Behind, but they've done a number of projects to rehumanize people who are in flight and are traveling, right? So how is it, what happens in camps? What are people trying to do? The stories of individuals, instead of just numbers or instead of images, which can be off-putting, which allow us to think about people in less useful ways. But this last piece that I wanted to talk about was, again, the problem of COVID and the absence of surveillance, that we no longer are watching, that things are being hidden from us, and that the thing that we need to insist upon doing is we need to go back to looking, right? That we absolutely need to make sure that we look. We need to demand of our media outlets that they look. So when things are published, we need to be encouraging. When things are not published, we need to demand more. For those of you who are academics, I really encourage you to participate in the conversation, which is how I found my way into this conversation to begin with, because anyone who has an academic affiliation is welcome to pitch an idea. And the idea behind the conversation is academic rigor and journalistic flair. And it seems to me, my blog piece that connected me to Elpida ended up being read by 20,000 people and then was translated into French and read by another 20,000. So personally, in my small office in the third largest city of Denmark, in Odense, teaching my 45 students per year, to have 40,000 potential readers is a much bigger audience than I've ever had in any other way, for any other piece of work. So it's a drop in the bucket, but it's a way of speaking. So I think we need to think creatively about how we speak and how we fight the silence. So anyone who's interested, you have my email. We will try, as we come back from, we ourselves come back from outside our Corona blanket. I'll try this this semester to reinvigorate my student group to see if we can, in fact, write this brief for the ICC, simply as a means of fighting against the quiet, right? To continue to focus. So that's the part that I'll do. I think we hope to have the meeting in Athens, and when we do, I hope to meet you there.